Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're gonna be looking a little bit more into the logic for making the sale trades inside of the sell UI so we can sell these items. I have gone ahead and set everything up already, so you'll be able to see the final product from the beginning, but I'll walk you through the changes so you can follow along with me. So let's start with some changes here. I renamed the inventory slot class that we had before into sales slot, because I think that captures better what we're doing here. So it's just a semantic change. The important change is that we're now capturing the item here, and that is gonna become very useful in a moment. So for now, just keep in mind that we're keeping the item, and I left the item price here, even though we can calculate the price every time as we need it. I wanted to keep it cached here just for simplicity. We may later refactor it out. Cool. So now we can go into the changes here. The first thing I want to look into is that instead of having the inventory here serialized field that we would populate through the editor, now I added a seller trader here, which basically is going to be the player. So we have a reference to the player. And inside of this trader profile, if you remember, we have the inventory, which is what we were capturing before, but we also have the wallet. And while we're not accessing the wallet directly, it's gonna become important to have access to the wallet in general when we're doing the transaction, so that the player can receive the gold from the sale. So we have that. I also renamed all the inventory slot related variables to sales slots. So we have sales slots here. We have a new list of selected sales slots. This is also for convenience, so we can keep track of all the items that are selected in the UI. If you remember here, we can select the items one by one, and we could go through a loop at runtime to capture that, but having this in a separate method that we can just capture the selected sales slots as needed and then use that as a cached property is very helpful later on, but we'll get to that. The rest are just renames here. I still have here the sale price. We'll probably end up removing that very soon. And then one thing I added here that's important is a transaction. We're going to be using the transactions as defined here in the trade class, where we're generating transactions based on which items we want to sell and the different buyer and sellers here. As you remember, the seller is the player and the buyer will be a generic merchant. So yeah, not much changes in the setup. We are setting the inventory, grabbing the inventory from the seller just to cache it. So we're not calling it every time. We could technically call it every time. I imagine there's not be much of a performance cost there, but that's that, and we initiate the list of selected slots. Other than that, everything is pretty much the same. Then here in the update sell UI, I made a few changes here. Last time we were here, we were just removing the label here and removing any selections, but there was a bug there. When we were selling the items, some of these properties would be left turned on. For example, the is on wasn't being reset to false. So even though the item would disappear from the slot, it would still look as if it was selected, which was very weird in some cases. So this will help with that. We just basically undo everything that we are doing here when we're setting up the items. We undo all of that for any slots that don't have items assigned to them. We changed a little bit the untoggle update, basically just refactoring the method out for capturing the selected slots, and then using the actual transaction to update the sale price here. So let's just jump into that and we'll get back to the untoggle update. So update the selected slots here. We just clear the list. So we start from 0, and then we go through all the slot toggles, and for any slot toggle that is on, we add it to the list. Pretty straightforward. Then we have Well, this, you can see here in the trade preview, we want to get the selected items. The preview method expects an array of items, and currently we're just selecting the slots. Every slot has an item. So when we go through getting the selected items, we create an items array, and then we go through every selected slot and then assign the item out. This may seem a little bit redundant, but it does keep that abstraction of working mostly through the slots here in the logic, and only getting the actual items in the slots when needed, which is basically just for the actual trade. In a later iteration, we may remove that extra complexity if it gets complicated, but for now that's it. And that's the on-toggle update. We just update the selected slots, use the active transaction to get the kind of like the transaction set up, and then we just check in the gold to receive because we know it's a sale, so the seller will be receiving some gold, and we put that as the sale text here so that it actually shows here in the UI. When we're updating things, we'll see it here come up, which is pretty much what it was doing before. Just now it's going through a transaction instead of going through every item and adding the price manually here, which is actually better. If we later change how we do transactions, we wouldn't need to come back and update this. So we went through all of this, and the last thing that is left here is to actually execute the sale. So when the big thing is when people or when the player clicks on the sell button here, when they click the sell button, we actually want the sale to happen. So a few things we check in the beginning before there's any interaction with the UI, the transaction is null. So if there's no active transaction, we just return and there's no sale here to execute. But if there is a transaction, then we do the finalized transaction. So that if you remember here from the trade class, we have this finalized transaction that basically goes through 4 movements. One is moving the items from the seller to the buyer, moving the gold from the buyer to the seller, and the opposite. In a couple of these transactions, there'll be nothing because the seller is not going to be giving gold on top of the items, and the buyer is not going to be giving items on top of the gold, at least not now. But this way of setting it up means that regardless of how the transaction is being handled, it will work. So if this was an item buy, the items to give would be nothing, but the gold to give would be the price of the items, and the items to receive would be whatever the merchant is selling the player, and the gold to receive would be nothing because the player is not getting any gold on top of the items. The player is giving the gold. So that's how that's set up. We finalize the transaction. That tells us was the transaction successful or not, because at any point if anything goes wrong with the trade here, if there's not enough gold, or if the items are not there, whatever's happening, if there's any error, it will be false. And then we have this debug line here, just in general for now, because we don't have any feedback for the player. This will be later replaced with feedback for the player. We can actually add that here. Here we can just put that there. So adding feedback to the player. That can be a visual effect, there can be some text that we show. We'll figure that out later. And then if the transaction was successful, then we want to do a couple of things. We update the sell UI. If you remember now, we have fewer items. We've sold some of them, ideally. So we should go back through all the slots and update them properly. Whichever slots that previously had items that now won't have items need to be reset. That will happen here. And depending on how the items were sold, there may be other items that need to be rearranged. So it's the same items, but they get shifted around the slots. So we update the slots with the items as well. So we update the UI and then we nullify the transaction. If there's any UI update, the on-toggle update will likely trigger, and that will update the transaction appropriately, which will be pretty much an empty transaction at this point. But we don't want to depend on that. Things could change later. So it's better just to nullify the active transaction. So until there's actually something happening in the UI again, we will get a transaction just in case some of the behavior changes. This method should make sure that it's not possible to re-execute the same transaction immediately. And that's happening here. That is basically it. It's pretty straightforward. We had all the work done previously from the UI. It was just about wiring things together. So it should be pretty straightforward. Now let's actually check this out. I'm going to put on the headset and we'll see how it's looking. Cool. So we have here the scene view, and here you can see part of what I'm seeing in the headset. As usual, I'm using virtual desktop and SteamVR. For whatever reason, the hands don't really work in the beginning, so resetting the scene. Now I have hands. I have a log here that I can use later. For now, we can just come here, see the UI. If you look in the design, it may not be very noticeable, but I added some depth to some of the elements, and now if you kind of look around, there's a little bit of parallax effect, which gives some depth to the UI. It's kind of nice. Just a nice little touch here. So now we can select items here, and you can see everything is still working, even though it's coming from the transaction, not actually adding these prices manually. It's still giving us the right price, which is great. So let's sell one of these logs. Log sold. If we actually look at the status, you may be able to see here at the bottom that the sale was successful. For now, we can just check the console. You can see it here in the console. Sale was successful. That's basically everything that's going on here. We now have the UI working, add a little bit of graphics to it. We may need to, we'll likely add icons later, but for now, this allows us to select and deselect items, and then everything's getting calculated properly, and when we sell things, they actually get sold. One cool thing to see here is that the way that everything is set up, technically you can think of the merchant as an NPC, but it could just as well be another player. And we have this set up here in the inspector here, where we have the seller is the player, but we could change that at runtime to be any player. And the buyer here is a generic merchant, which you would think naturally to be an NPC, but could as well be another player. You know, if it's a multiplayer game, or if we add multiplayer to this. But you can actually step into this, and you can see for the player, you can see the player inventory here, which has the inventory state. We go to state, and currently we have nothing. We could add a log here, and I think that should be pretty straightforward. We add 1. Let's do 3. So we have 3. I can just add a log to all 3 of them, and then if I reset here the scene, we now have logs again. Okay. Something else we probably want to see is the wallet, right? We've been selling some logs. We currently don't have any UI to display how much gold the player has, but if we go to the player wallet, we can see we have 100 gold. That means that throughout the different tests that I've been doing, I've sold a total of 10 logs. And if we make this 0, and then go and let's see, doing this without the headset on can be a little bit tricky, but we add a log here and sell it. You can see immediately that now I have 10 gold. So the sale is actually happening here. And more importantly, if you go to the merchant wallet, which is set up in the same way, to the sell UI, you go to the merchant as a trader profile, and that has an inventory and a wallet. So we go to the merchant wallet here. Originally, we set this to be 99,999, and now that we've sold the merchant 11 logs, we've subtracted 110 gold from the merchant's wallet. For now, this doesn't matter much, but if you think this as player interactions with different players with different inventories and wallets, you do want everything to be true, not just to generate and make gold disappear from the economy, but things to stay true. At some other point, we'll need to figure out how does the merchant, if it's an NPC especially, how does the merchant replenish its stock of items and replenishes his wallet so that the player can sell more stuff to the merchant later, but we will get to that at a later date. For now, that's pretty much it. We have a working UI that allows us to grab things from the inventory and sell them to the merchant. So this part is done. It's all prefab. We'll add it back to a new scene where we can mix the other things that we built with the different interactions, and then we will have a full loop here. The thing that's missing now and that we'll be tackling next video will be actually having a merchant in the scene. Should be some NPC graphic. Now I'll find a model for it, and then actually coding the interaction so that when you approach the merchant, you can interact with the merchant, and that brings up this UI, and then we can do the sale and then close it and all of that. We will handle that next. For now, this is what we have. I hope that you enjoyed watching this, and I will see you again next time. Thank you.